We are on one of the highest points in the parish of St. Lucie, a community that affords panoramic views of the northern and northeastern coastlines of the island. Welcome to Josie Hill. This is my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time. The initial discussion is carried by Godfrey Hines and Joel Headley. Godfrey begins by speaking of those areas from which the community of Josie Hill was carved out.
We came out of four main plantations. We had lowlands on the northern side, Chancel on the western, Lambert's south, and the Cove on the eastern side.
Josie Hill overlooks the lowlands area by corner, and actually there's a panoramic view of the northeastern coastline right around to the north of St. Lucie. So you have a view from Pico Tenerife, just off Boscobel, Cove Bay, Little Bay, you can see Chandler's Bay, Nance Bay, and there's Goat House River Bay, all the way out to the Animal Flower Cave. And then, of course, then the villages in between, Graveyard, Pike Corner. On the northern side, you have Rockfield, Lowlands, and you can see as far as Hope Road and Connelltown.
If you look around the area, Josie Hill, Free Hill, the Chancel area, these are all picturesque areas, beautiful areas. It is a dream to just sit or stand on the hills and view the surroundings. Breathtaking, tranquil, and revitalizing, I must say. At the end of the Mount View Drive, there's a hill. From that hill, you can see virtually from Cove Bay down to Half Moon Fort. That hill is called Saddle Pretty Hill, a part of our communities.
Saddle Pretty Hill is on the western side of Josie Hill. It is worth your mention for obvious reason. As you approach Saddle Pretty Hill, you will come upon the monument which was erected in 2003 in celebration of Life and Light Apostolic Church, which was established here in 1953. Saddle Pretty Hill will be explored in another series called Landscapes and People. It's now back to Josie Hill proper on the eastern side as we explore the views that are afforded again from the eastern side of Josie Hill.
I want to talk about the views because there's a sort of tranquility when you sit in these hills, and it's only interrupted by the sound of nature, the birds and the monkeys and so on. Or when we hear the bell at St. Clement's Church, when we know that there's a funeral or some special service, and we would go in the hill and sit and listen to the service because there's a series of caves in the gully, and that amplifies the sounds. So we can listen to a funeral service quite comfortably, and then watch the cortege move from the church over to the burial ground. I've spent several hours studying for my O-level, sitting in a tree, in the hills up and overlooking Pike Corner. And I can tell you that from personal experience that there's no more beautiful experience of you, almost spiritual, when you sit and watch the morning sun rise majestically from behind the horizon, and the first morning rays shimmer on the waters of Cove Bay. And then you look inland and you see the churches. You see Bennett's Temple, you see the Kearfield Seventh-day Adventists, the Western Holiness, and then at the foot of the hill, there's St. Clement's. You're looking onto it. You take a glance to the left, and then you see your old alma mater, the primary school which helped formed you. And then, of course, then next to that is the final resting place where you might end up. And it makes you think and become very philosophical. I think it's the most beautiful place to be, the tranquility, and you can find yourself at peace in Josie Hill. And there's not a lot of, you won't hear me rancor and so on out here. It's quite peaceful and we all get along. Another important aspect of George Hill too is the gullies and the roads they play. There is to the south of here, between Peterson's and Lambert's, a gully, a water course runs between there. North of Peterson's, there's another course almost in the center of the area. And the two converge just near St. Clement's Church. And the water, that carries the water from here out behind St. Clement's Church and out to Chandler's Bay. So it drains the area so we don't flood. But these hills and gullies were integral to the socio-economic development and well-being of the community. For example, the flat areas were used to grow crops, graze the animals. And then these areas that the animals graze, the animals serve as the lawnmowers because then we played cricket and football on these areas. Now, the slopes were used to plant the pea trees and the fruit trees.
But one area of produce that was very much sought after by all Barbadians was the Barbadian groundnut. Those were grown right here in these communities, quite a few in Peters's. I know that the Freehill produced quite a few pounds of nuts. People came from all over Barbados to get their hands on these groundnuts. I also must mention that these groundnuts seem to be unique to this part of Barbados. I've heard several people who came from overseas mention that they have a different taste from any other nut that they would taste any part of the world. Tasty and well sought after. It's really something that we possibly could make an industry out of at some time.
Yes, he is correct. These nuts are like no other, and they have remained consistent over the years. Now back to the natural beauty of this community.
The bottom of the gully, which is the water course, now those will be the pathways to traverse the community by day or by night, and sometimes pitch black using the light of the fireflies to navigate the gullies. My grandmother would always tell us, you see some lights in the gully, the duppy smoking. So you got to be careful, you have to be with somebody. And only when I grew up, I realized that they were fireflies. but for several years, I believed that they were duppies. So you had to be accompanied by somebody, but that was a way of keeping you in check.
The wisdom of a grandmother. Today we call the radio talk shows, we write letters to the editor. We complain that government is not sending workers to clean and the bush or pathways and gullies. Thankfully, the folks in Josie Hill back then understood the importance of taking care of their environment and ensuring that it was safe and clean for all residents.
In fact, we had as a project almost every summer to clear the gullies. One, to have access to the fruit trees, and two, the gullies were used to traverse the area. We went to school at St. Clement's. It's probably go church in that area because the two churches in Josie Hill, this church, and then the Salvation Army, and then some people then would go to the Wesley Holders and the Anglican Church. So you had various tracks through the hill, so you had to keep the tracks clear. And you also had to keep it clear too because of the old wives' tales and so on. My grandmother walked from Josie Hill to the Arms House, which is the district hospital, every day for 32 years. And sometimes she would come back home late at night, and we would go and meet her. But we had to be accompanied because the Hartmen might hold you after dark. And there were some well-known or the takers who were reputed to be Hartmen. So I was around Christmas time. you had to be very careful. We knew every pebble, every couple, because we would walk through pitch black, and you would walk through there. And when they gully out, because no, a lot of rain don't fall. Back then when it rains, heavy rains, you want to be flowing like a river, and those old girls would find a way across. Crocus bag, plastic bags, something on their foot, cover themselves, and they would hold each other, and my grandmother actually swam that gully from time to time, you know. But the gully was a source of recreation, source of food, it was a pathway down to the other areas of school, and so on. And we had a duty to ensure that we debush the gully and so on. And despite all of the trees around, we had nobody troubling anybody and so on. The older ones look after the younger ones and so on.
You would note that Joel said it was their duty to keep the area clean and safe. Oh, how I wish that we would see it as our duty and responsibility to do the same today. Now, let's take a look at farming and what is arguably one of the more valuable lessons we could learn from this vocation. And more importantly, how our backyard farming informed the jargon of a profession today.
Farming was very important to the community. Just about every household engaged in some form of farming, whether it be livestock or growing provisions. And in fact, these families brought to life a lot of the fancy terms used now in financial planning and wealth management. Because we've referred to the animals as stock, and you had a whole portfolio. So you would have chickens, sheep, ducks, goat, cow, pig. But you would have the chickens, and you would provide eggs and perhaps meat for probably a weekly meal. The sheep, more long term, that would probably buy shoes and so on down the line. The pigs and the cows, more long term investments. So come September, they'll be ready to be sold to buy uniforms and so on for your children. So you had short, medium, and long term investments in your portfolio. And then, and when you hear about don't put all your eggs in one basket, that was lived out every day because you had to go under the cellar to collect the eggs. And if a fowl decided to pick at you and you scramble, you might break all the eggs if you have it in one container. So you carry about 2 containers. So you put probably a dozen in one and pass one side, dozen. So you spread your risk. You know, you say sheep and goats don't mix. But again, sheep are more docile than goats. Goats tend to climb. So you have to make the pen more secure, and goats would butt. So when you hear about you don't mix your investments, you treat them differently. I always go back to the sheep and the goats. Sheep and goats don't mix, you separate and you treat them differently. So a lot of that brought life or meaning to what you learn in a formal setting in terms of financial planning.
How many of us thought of that? Yes, the animals were referred to as stocks, and those fancy financial terms of today were influenced by animal husbandry. Now, in these villages, there were great craftsmen and, I should say, women also.
No. The village also always had skilled tradespeople. You had skilled carpenters. I remember George Babby, and you always had an apprentice along with you, so George Babby would have a cat. And we always had nicknames for everybody. My mother was a seamstress, and she had taught girls. I grew up knowing there was a green bench in the house, and the young girls she taught lots of women in St. Lucie to sew. And then she outfitted bridal parties and so on. And I was the delivery boy. So I had to traverse from here to Pike Corner, Graveyard, sometimes Rockfield, as far as River Bay with clothes on my back. I knew the vital statistics of just about every woman in St. Lucie area because she had a little book and she would write these things down and I would read it. So when she put a dress on the wall, I You could tell exactly who it belonged to. And you had Georgie Fitzpatrick, who was a tailor. And you had, I think it was Puckett, who was the mason in the area. But no, the families always insisted that every child or every generation does better than the other one. So now we have, in addition to the skilled tradesmen, we have doctors in the area, lawyers, police, nurses, the whole range, bankers, the whole range of professions. And that is testimony to that not only nourishment, but the encouragement by the members of the community to have every generation improve over the other one.
Let us speak now about the nourishment of the soul. You heard earlier of St. Clement's Church, which is below the hill. But in Josie Hill proper, there are two churches, the Salvation Army and Philippi. David Headley leads the latter.
The church started in 1949, somewhere in 1949. And at one point in time, it was across the road, there by where Marlene's shop, the shop across the road is. I was told that the church was out there. And then it moved right on the corner there. And we were there for quite a while. Well, my grandmother was the pastor of the church at Josie Hill. My grandmother was Naomi Brooms. She had lived at Durham, St. Lucie, just next to Spring Hall there. She was a very timely lady. She never got to church late, and she was always on time. She more or less set a good example for me because her standard of life really set the precedence for me. I remember her more so than my mother. You know, she was very outstanding in her Christian qualities. Some of the people who used to be with my grandmother, they all passed. People like Ethel and Gill, and Doreen Minor that lived across the road there. A lot of people. In fact, most of the members of the church, they came from nearby. Only one or two persons that they lived down Spring Hall. That was Miss Sobers. She used to come through the gully and come up. And one thing I remember for those old folks, rain couldn't keep them home. They would get sometimes bags, crocus bags or funny bags, rather than having a parasol or umbrella. If it needs having two pairs of shoes, one to come through the gully. And then when they get to church, they would change off. But they had a zeal for God, and nothing stopped them from being at church. And regardless of how many times church kept for the week, they were there. They were there. And especially revival times, I remember revival times when we used to get churches from Christ Church, St. Andrew, all over Barbados. And they will come, sometimes we have revival service for 3 weeks. And every night, those are the days when people would leave the district and come around the church. But nowadays you keep service, you don't find anybody around the church. You know? So those are the days I remember.
It is quite interesting that we move from the church to the village shop, another one of those celebrated institutions in early Barbadian communities. These shopkeepers practice 1 Corinthians 13:13, and now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. As we traverse the island visiting communities and learning of their social history, there is one recurring theme as it relates to the village shop: their extended charity.
There were a number of shops. One was Maud Phillips. Actually, Maud Phillips was my great aunt. And I'm told she died when I was about a year old. But she was known as a philanthropist. You know, if you didn't have the money to pay, she would credit value, and that they call it trust. But she would trust you. When she died, my aunt Sylvia inherited that shop, and she ran it along the same lines. I had a conversation with her during the week, and she mentioned it to me that that was the legacy model left behind, is that you have to extend charity. And it might be interesting that the hill where the shop was called the Large Hill. So maybe that had some bearing on that. There was another shop just short, just across from the church here. There was Mrs. Roach. Again, too, you could go, and I remember the brown sheet of paper, or making the list, and you go back and you carry a few cents, and you pay and reduce your credit. We had Schema, short bit, but Schema was more the drinks and so on. There were quite a few bakers as well. There was a baker family, there is a baker family, but there were bakers as well. At the top of Joseph Hill, Mrs. Leslie, you could stay down the road and smell Miss Leslie when she kitchen when she's baking. But she was also very good at cakes. Did fantastic wedding cakes. You had Vaughn's. She was known for her yeast breads. And on Sundays around 5, 6, the aroma is right across the area, and convoys of fellas come across from Mount Gay. We lined up for Vaughn's bread. But in between there you have, and more recent times there was GNR Bakery, Mr. Griffith, and so on. But every household had cooks, and the men in particular were the bakers. My uncle Costa, he would make a stiff coconut bread. Somebody else would make a soft, the textures were different, but they all tasted good. And, you know, we could sniff, or we go outside, we just sniff, depending on which way the direction the wind is blowing in. And we would head towards there, and loiter and play around the house, because you're guaranteed to get some hot sweet bread. You know, and that was part of everyday living, sharing some sweet bread, sharing some food, and life went on. There was always the aroma of food in the atmosphere in Joseph Hill. Morning breakfast, lunchtime, evening dinner. You could walk and you sniff, and you get fat from the calories inhaling the atmosphere. But one thing that stands out is the village fed the children. The village raised the children. We had a strong maternal influence within our community. And you can move from one house to the next and get food. I think a lot of us share the same DNA pool, but we fed each other. I mean, I personally ate at 3 houses, sometimes twice a day. But you could not go hungry. And something I must say, though, is that they not only fed your bodies, they fed your minds, because they were always speaking to you. They were talking to you about improving your lot. And they spoke to us in terms that were positive. So we did not have low self-esteem. You were told you aren't fat, you're plump, or you're rosy, you're not short, you're squat. You know, so you don't walk around feeling less than. My mother always said, don't sell yourself short. You know, and the philosophy of life for us was always deeply rooted in the gully. And you always spoke to us in terms of the gully. And there's one that stands out with me all the time, and it's that poverty is a state of the mind. You see, you might be born next to a gully, but never let your mind be in that gully. Always rise above your circumstances, but never forget where you come from, because the fellow you left behind and you kick, he might kick you on your way back down. Respect is due, even unto a dog. And that has been my philosophy in life. But a lot of us have been told that about. Be respectful. Always remember the gully nourished you. And this community always embraced you. And even today, you can't suffer within this Joseph Hill community. Somebody reaches out to you and lend a helping hand, whether it be the church, whether it be individual members of your family. There's always a helping hand for members of this community, and there's deep respect for each other.
It makes you want to relocate to this community of Josie Hill, sharing and caring, giving to someone who cannot give in return, serving without thought of recognition or personal gain. Now, by putting aside our differences and striving towards the common community goal of looking out for the interests of each other and working in such a manner that you leave your community better than how you found it, you build a great community. Josie Hill is such a community. Special thanks to all of our guests. This has been My Community Josie Hill, and with this edition, we conclude our travels here in the parish of St. Lucy for 2021. See you next week in St. Peter. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. It's goodbye for now.